Everyone, welcome to Bible Month training for 2020. We are here in Salisbury, but we're being joined by people from Ashford in Kent, from Leatherhead, from Guernsey, and from Jersey, and a whole bunch of other people that I know are watching from home and from a few odd places around the world. So it's good to be here, and I welcome you all. Can we open with a word of prayer? Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for this time together, and we thank you for your word that you have given to us. Help us today to grow in our understanding of it, and grow in our understanding of how it speaks to us, speaks to our world, and calls us to follow you. We put today into your hands. Amen. We're very lucky to have Dr. Ruth Starr with us today to lead us in the studies. Ruth is the Director of Studies for the undergraduate program and the Methodist tutor for biblical studies at the Queen's Foundation. As one might expect, she has a long and distinguished academic career, Doctor of Theology and Master of Sacred Theology. But Ruth is a Methodist through and through, having had her Methodist identity shaped by the strong tradition of social engagement in the Methodist Church in Argentina, as well as by studying ecumenically alongside Roman Catholic and Protestant women in Latin America. Initially inspired by the account of the murder of Oscar Romero in her GCSE textbook, her studies have led her across South America, Peru, and Argentina to explore liberation theologies, to spend time with priests, with religious sisters, with community workers, learning from Latin American women and theologians, and worked with women from Uruguay and from Argentina to publish journal articles exploring women's experience of everyday violence and how they resist everyday violence. Her doctoral focus was on theologies of marriage, and she's currently developing that into a book which will bring into critical dialogue Argentine and English contexts of domestic violence and Catholic and Protestant theologies of marriage. Rachel has published a number of books. I'm not going to read them all to you. I'm not even going to read all the titles to you. One of them is Reimagining Theologies of Marriage in Context of Domestic Violence. One which I think will be familiar to you, she wrote with David Holgate, the Study Guide to Biblical Hermeneutics, which will be familiar from your worship leading and preaching studying, I think. And she also wrote in 2001, Being White, Challenging White Supremacy. So it's with great pleasure, great excitement, and we're really grateful for you being here, Rachel. And we'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Introduction. Thank you very much, Adrian. That's great. Yes, I couldn't have said it better myself. So it's great to be with you here in Salisbury, and also those of you that are joining us through the live streaming. I hope that you will that you're comfy and you've got good cups of coffee or tea to hand, and you're going to enjoy the day with us. So first thing to remember is how to move the slides, so I'll do that first. We're focusing this morning on the book of Ruth. There'll be 2 sessions with a break in between. The first will be a little bit longer because we're going to do some introductory work and then look at chapters 1 and 2, then have a break, look at chapters 3 and 4, and have a brief time for questions before we break for lunch, and then further questions that people are going to text or send in via the miracles of the streaming site to be kind of gathered up at the end of the day. So let's get started. Our first session is called Peace and Justice Shall Kiss, On the Road with Ruth. We're going to begin by thinking about what seems like quite a simple question, and those of you who have got sight of the handout will know that it's on the top of your handout. What kind of a story is this? So have a little moment's pause, or maybe jot down a couple of ideas. What kind of story is Ruth? Okay, so let's just hear a couple of people in the room. I'll repeat what you say so that everybody else can catch it too. So what kind of a story is Ruth? Anyone want to offer a word, an idea, what kind of story we're going to be looking at? A romantic story at the front. So one vote for a romantic story. Okay, we'll come back to that. Any other ideas? A family story, a story about family and relationships and commitments. Yep, certainly there's plenty of that there. Anything else? A story of loyalty. And we get a lot of focus on the word hesed, which is to do with loving kindness, steadfast love, loyalty in some way. We'll come back to that certainly over this morning. Acceptance, yes. So a story about difference, perhaps, and how we negotiate difference. Okay, lovely. And then one at the back. How we overcome adversity. I didn't get the first bit, but I got that. So, yeah. So the kind of commitment that we make, that putting everything in, so that we can overcome adversity. Yeah. Okay. So perhaps something about survival there. All right. Well, let's see what I had down. And apologies in advance, because I'm going to slightly suggest that some of your answers may need a little bit of nuancing in some way. But all of those themes that we've mentioned already are present in Ruth. It's just that there are also other things going on. So, this is a simple story. It's a story that's actually super complicated. It's multi-layered. So at first glance, we think, what a lovely story. Nice and short. We like that. Some characters that we can recognize and get behind. But there's a lot going on. Even in the Hebrew itself is complicated, has ambiguities, tensions, odd breaks in it. There's lots going on within the text, and there's lots of different ways of reading this text, as we'll discover during today. So it's not a simple story. It's not a serious story. If anything, it's a bit of a comedy. It could be described as carnivalesque. By that I mean we could see it being part of that time of wild abandon, that time when everything is upside down that we encounter at Carnival, or just before we enter into Lent. So think Mardi Gras or other kind of carnival moments. It's not a safe story, and this might be something that we haven't been encouraged to see within the text, but the text is full of violence. That violence often goes unmentioned in our churches, but one of the things I want to invite us to do this morning is to think about how we talk helpfully about violence and resistance to violence. And it's not really a love story. There is love in it. There is lots of loving kindness between different communities, different people, but it's not really a love story. It's not about how a girl finds a man. It's about how a girl and another girl or women survive. So how do people survive? That's really what I feel is at the heart of this book. Okay, so are you already beginning to think, oh, I don't know, I don't like the turn this morning's going in? Well, bear with me and we'll see how we get on. So we've thought a little bit about what kind of things what are our expectations that we bring to the book of Ruth. I'm going to think now about some of the context in which we set the book of Ruth before we go on to begin to get into the text. So the first context is the historical context. And I've suggested that we might think about Ruth as a book about seeking peace in times of violence or seeking justice in broken places. Ruth itself as a story, so the narrative context, is the gap between, in the days when the judges ruled, which is how the book begins, to, right at the end of the book, the mention of King David. So it's a story about the transition from a time of judges to a time of the monarchy within ancient Israel. And for some people, the suggestion is that Ruth is written as a way of justifying the introduction of the monarchy within ancient Israel, which, as you may remember from the books of Samuel, is highly contested. So within the books of Samuel, there is one tradition that says, yes, great, we have a king, David, God is with David, wonderful. And we have another tradition right there in the same text that says, having a king is the worst mistake you can make, and it's all going to end disastrously. So how does Ruth fit in? Perhaps Ruth is a text that's written to kind of shore up the idea of kingship, and perhaps even more so when you're dealing with a king like David, to make David seem a little bit better, because goodness knows David needs a little bit of a kind of a better PR than he gets elsewhere. But it's more likely to have been written much later than the time of the beginnings of the monarchy. It's more likely to be written when Judah, or as it was then, Yehud, was a small province, a small tiny community within the big Persian Empire. The Persian Empire stretched at one point from Egypt across to India, the edges of India. Huge, massive. And after the time in slavery, in exile in Babylon, the Jewish leaders and religious folk and political leaders who returned back to what had become the province of Yehud, or Judah as we might know it better, were really struggling with how did they survive in this vast sea of the Persian Empire. Who were they? They felt under threat. Their community had been destroyed, their temple perhaps had been destroyed. Certainly it was the end of the monarchy. They had been scattered and only a few had returned. So what did they do? Well, on the one side, there were people who said, we're under threat, we feel anxious about our identity, let's close in. Let's erect borders. Let's make it so that people can't come into us. Let's decide that we are different from our neighbours and we will have nothing to do with them. Sound familiar? And those kind of traditions and ideas are very present within the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which perhaps came from this similar time to Ruth, that talked about sending away foreign wives, excluding people who were different from the worshipping and social life of the community. Whereas Jonah and the book of Ruth perhaps are written to offer another alternative, to say, look, we actually need people who are different to us. We need and we value people who bring something that is other than us and our traditions. We need to have that diversity within our communities. So perhaps a huge amount we can learn from Ruth at this time when we're facing similar tensions within our own nation. So far, so good? Yeah, okay, all right, good. Let's move on then. So that's a little bit about the narrative and historical setting. What else is going on that Ruth might be trying to speak into when it was written? What about the social setting? Well, by that, I mean, how does Ruth engage with some of the social and legal norms that we might not be familiar with within our own context today? Ruth, as a text within the Jewish tradition, is read at the festival of Shavuot, which is the harvest festival, and also the festival that celebrates the giving of the law or the Torah. Now, as Christians, we're often, maybe not even consciously, used to setting the law against grace or the law against the spirit or the law against freedom in some way. And I want to suggest to you that that's a really unhelpful way of seeing the law, because the law within the Jewish tradition is a gift from God. It's a gift that is celebrated. The law is loved. The law is a way in which the people are helped to find their way back to God. There is nothing bad or negative about the law. And that's how it's seen within Ruth. It's seen as wholly positive, something that is to be valued, celebrated, and entered into wholeheartedly because it enables people to live well together. So, which particular aspects of the law might be coming to the fore within Ruth? Well, Some of these will not be a surprise to those of you who've had a little read through of Ruth before today or have known it in the past. So let's just go back. First of all, the talk about gleaning. There's lots about the need for Ruth and Naomi to be able to find food. One of the ways that happens early on in the text is that Ruth goes out to glean in the fields, to collect up the leftover grain that has been missed by the people who are harvesting, to kind of scrabble around in the corners, pick up things that are left over. And the right to gleaning was particularly for the poor and the stranger. So specifically, the stranger was one of the people who had that right to glean. This is about a community that's seeking to find a way for there to be everybody to be able to get food. So gleaning is about the community seeking to recognise there are people who need support, who need help, and trying to do that in a way that works with the agricultural system. Secondly, one of the other teachings that we encounter within Ruth is the rulings about the lever or the Levirate marriage. And this is something which feels probably a lot less familiar to us today. Can anyone remember what Levirate marriage is all about? Anybody want to offer an idea? Yes. Yeah, so continuation of the family name and particularly kind of care and concern for your brother's family. Yes, that is in the most positive way that we can name it. So it's about the idea that if a man dies without having children, his brother has a responsibility to have a child really on his behalf with his widow, so that the name will not be lost. There's that kind of sense of a continuation. But you can see how very quickly that might get pretty tricky, and there might be lots of questions around choices and agency in that. What about kinship and the idea of the kin redeemer? Well, we'll come back to that later on this morning, but that also is about responsibility for the kin or for the family. It's about the idea that if someone is going to fall into debt and therefore enslavement, if someone's land is going to be lost, then other people within the kin have the responsibility to redeem it, to buy it back in some way, to restore it to the family. So both name and land are important and are things that are held not just by the immediate family, but by the kin as a whole. Yet, as we'll find in Ruth, neither of those laws are really strictly followed in the ways we might expect. There's a lot of ambiguity, and we could read that as, well, the people of Ruth, who wrote Ruth or the characters within Ruth don't know the law so well, but it could also be about the ambiguities and spaces within the law that allow people to offer more than they are required, to go beyond the boundaries of the law and to offer even more out of generosity, out of loving kindness. So there's something there about not saying this is exactly what you have to do, but allowing people to go even beyond that. And then we've already mentioned a little bit about the law and boundaries. The law has quite a lot to say about the Moabites, of which Ruth and Orpah belong to that community. The Moabites are a community that is very close, a nation that is close to Judah, but sworn enemies really, with a long history of conflict and disagreement. Conflict and disagreement that is in some way rooted about the idea that the Moabites didn't welcome the Israelites when they were in the wilderness, and in other ways is rooted in this notion that the Moabites are a nation that somehow are impure in some way because they're connected to the story of Lot having sex with his daughters, and one of the daughters, their child, becomes known as Moab. So there's a kind of sense there that to talk about the Moabites is to talk about an unclean people. Now, the Moabites would see it differently. They might tell very different stories about themselves, as we shall see. So a lot going on there, a lot about the social context in which Ruth is set, very purposefully. It's not. It's designed to speak into these different texts, which leads us on to the next question, which I think is on your handout if you've got sight of it, or those of you who don't have sight of it can still think about. What kind of books might we place alongside Ruth from the Bible? So which other biblical books seem to connect very strongly to Ruth? I'm going to ask you to have a little think and then maybe just chat with your neighbour for a minute. What's another book that seems to speak to Ruth or connect to Ruth in some way? There's lots of different possibilities, so just go with what your kind of initial feeling is and share with your neighbour. I'll give you a minute to do that. I'm going to interrupt you, as I'll probably do all morning. Just when you get to the good stuff, I pop up and say, stop talking and come back together. So apologies. Let's have some ideas. So just pop your hand up maybe, and we'll just hear a couple of different ideas about books that kind of seem to connect to Ruth, seem to speak to Ruth. Okay, who's got some ideas? Yes. Jonah, okay. Well, it's certainly a similar length, isn't it? Written at a similar time. What other reasons did you have for Jonah? Okay, so it's a text that's looking at inclusion and exclusion. So are the Ninevites to be saved, etc. Just so the kind of Moabite, Ninevite parallel there, perhaps. And it's also a text that we might call a novella, a story, a short story. So Jonah, Ruth, the story of Joseph as well are all described often as novellas. So a little novel, a short story. Okay. Others? Yes. Yes, because you're right at the back, I'm slightly struggling to hear you, but what I got from that was genealogy and Bethlehem, and what was the other thing? Yes, yes, wonderful. So that would lead us to, thank you, Adrian. That would lead us to the beginning of Matthew's Gospel. Did anyone else get the beginning of Matthew's Gospel? That there's a genealogy there which mentions a number of people, including Ruth. And that's the only time Ruth's mentioned in the New Testament. We'll come back to that in a moment, but thank you. That's a great one. Yes?
Listening to your point about going beyond boundaries, going beyond the sort of letter of the law, put me in mind of Paul's letter to Philemon.
Okay, Yes, good. Now I'm immediately out of my comfort zone because that's New Testament. I'm thinking, oh, help. But I remember that's about the letter that's sent to the person who's been enslaved, or the person who's perceived as the owner of the enslaved person. So say a little bit about the link there.
Well, in the sense of, Paul's arguing that he should accept this runaway slave back, which was obviously beyond the sort of legal expectations about what you might do with a runaway slave.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So that sense of law or social kind of assumptions being a starting point, not an end point, that within the Jewish and Christian communities, as with many other faith communities, we're asked to go beyond the letter of the law, or beyond what the law specifically requires of us. Thank you. Okay. One more. Yes.
Well, that's also true of Hosea, isn't it? In terms of, he could have divorced his wife, but God was saying don't.
Yeah. Yeah, so Hosea, that's a really interesting one, because there's a lot there, obviously the kind of connection with marriage and relationships that Hosea and Gomer are kind of connected into. Lots of relationships that are problematic within Hosea, so a huge amount of violence, but also that a kind of desire to somehow have the relationship restored or redeemed in some way. So yeah, another great connection. Okay, well, let's see where I got to. You'll see some of your suggestions are up there. Okay, so we've got Leviticus and Deuteronomy because of the legal codes that we get in those texts that then appear and are kind of worked out in Ruth. So some people see Ruth as what might be called a midrash on the law, an exploration of the law in some ways. Judges and Samuel because of the setting, the narrative setting, and because in the Christian canon, certainly the book of Ruth falls between those two books. Jonah we've mentioned, and another short story that is headed by a woman or named for a woman, Esther, which again we'll see has lots of connections to Ruth in different ways. The book of Proverbs, in some traditions and at some points, Ruth came after the book of Proverbs, which you'll remember ends with Proverbs 31, the poem of the strong woman. Don't let anyone call it the good wife. It's not the good wife. It's the strong or capable woman that we encounter within Proverbs 31. And Ruth, in some way, is like the strong woman, but she's also like the wise woman and the strange woman that come earlier within Proverbs. Song of Songs, well, lots of reasons why a pop song of songs in there. Another story about living and relationships and everyday life and desire and confusion around desires. So plenty of things there. Job, particularly because of the character of Naomi and the way that both Job and the book of Ruth begin and end with stories of loss, and then perhaps end with that sense that loss is somehow being restored, although in both cases it hasn't been restored. So Job and Job's wife lose everything, and even though that's supposedly restored at the end of Job, it's not really. That grief continues, and the same as we'll see with Naomi. Who else? We've mentioned Matthew about the genealogies. James, because of that sense of James as a text about living faithfully, walking the walk, having responsibility to act well with others. And Genesis, because, goodness me, where to start? There are so many connections with Genesis. There's lots of allusions to particular characters, and there's direct quotations or references to particular characters in Genesis. But there's also some stuff there in connection with the story of Joseph about grain and famine and moving because of famine. So plenty of ways in which you might, as leaders and preachers, link some of those texts into Ruth. Okay, so we've thought about historical, social, and what we might call canonical, the place where Ruth is within the canon, where the place where Ruth occupies in the conversation that is our biblical canon. What about the interpretive conversation? Where do we find Ruth in the history of interpretation? Well, what we find is that Ruth has various moments where Ruth is in vogue as a biblical text to be studied. And certainly in the last few decades, there has been an explosion of writing on Ruth. I mean, I started doing the work on the Bible Month magazine in the summer. Thought, well, I'll get through this reading, no problem. And it just hasn't stopped. There's still books and books and books and more books, more commentaries, more articles about Ruth that are written from many different perspectives that I am absolutely loving reading. So there's a few ideas within the Bible Month magazine of where you might read more about Ruth, and I encourage you to follow those on. What do you notice about the different interpreters that I've put up on this slide? They're all women, yeah, okay. And that isn't to say that there aren't plenty of male scholars who write on Ruth that are, and that's great, and I've certainly drawn from them. But I suppose I'm wanting to say that Ruth has been a particular focus in recent years, for feminist and womanist scholars. So by womanist, if you're not familiar with that term, that's African American women scholars who are writing about class and race and gender and the way that those impact on African American women. What else? Anything else you notice about the interpreters up there? Yeah. Yes. There's a great diversity of people's contexts, experiences and identities out of which they're reading the book of Ruth. And what I'm hoping this slide helps us to see is we all read Ruth from our own place. And that means we see some things that no one else can see, and we miss loads of things that other people will be able to see. So some of the ideas and readings of Ruth we're going to look at this morning will be quite different and stark to you, because the way that they've come about is through a particular experience. So again, maybe a question would be kind of test out, why is this so new to me? What is missing in my experience that I haven't seen that in the text? The other thing to mention is there's a number of Jewish scholars up on this slide. And again, that was a particular intention of mine because Ruth is primarily a Jewish text. It's a text first and foremost within the Jewish scriptures before Christianity claims the Jewish scriptures as part of the Christian scriptures as well. And I want us to be encouraged to hold open both Jewish readings and Christian readings of the text and not to collapse Ruth into a Christian reading. Okay, right, we're getting there. We're beginning to get to the beginning of Ruth. So one more slide before we do. A question about whose story is this? What would it feel like if, instead of being called the Book of Ruth, these 4 short chapters were called the Book of Naomi, or the Book of Boaz, or the Book of Orpah? How would that feel? Again, something to think about and something that I've wanted us to explore. And one of the ways I've done that is by naming each chapter after one of these characters. So with that in mind, we're going to turn to the Book of Orpah, chapter 1. I'm just going to have a little word of introduction, and then somebody is going to magically appear and read some of the text for us in a moment. So, the Book of Orpah. This is a book that begins and ends with the house of bread, in the house of bread in Bethlehem. So, Bethlehem meaning the house of bread. In the beginning, there is no bread in the house of bread. So you immediately get the sense that this text is saying more than we might read from the surface. At the end of the chapter, a return to Bethlehem where there is bread once more. And in the middle, a lot of this chapter takes place on the road with companions. Those of you who are kind of familiar with other languages will know that pan means with bread. So the companions on the road are those we share bread with. So the whole of the first chapter is kind of exploring the theme of bread. When do we have it? When we don't have it? How do we share what we have? So with that in mind, let's hear from Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 to 5 to begin with. Thank you.
went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons or her husband.
Thank you. So this beginning of the book of Ruth, or as we're calling it, the book of Orpah, is like a big siren saying, alert, alert, disaster, disaster. What do I mean by that? Well, we have mention of the judges. The time of the judges, we know, is a time when every man did what was right in their own eyes. It is not a good time. It is a time of chaos and violence. There was famine. Famine tends to be connected in some way with injustice within the biblical tradition, and certainly within our world today. And to top it all, we have a man from Judah who goes to live in Moab. There are 3 big red flashing buttons that are saying disaster is about to befall this family. Everything is going to go wrong. So the text spells it out pretty clearly to us. What about the names as well? The names in the Bible are often very symbolic. And again, immediately from the names, we would know that something disastrous was going to happen. We have Elimelech, which means my God is king. But this is the time of judges. And this man has fled from his own community, abandoned them, and gone and lived with the so-called enemy. We know he's going to get in trouble pretty quickly. We have Naomi, whose name is a bit ambiguous, as she is, but perhaps it means pleasant. But again, whether Naomi can remain pleasant is to be seen. And then their children, Mahlon and Chilion, which means a little illness, a little destruction. We know where they're going, and pretty quickly they get wiped out too. And we're left with Naomi and 2 Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. We're often encouraged to set these women against each other. I want to encourage us not to do that, and particularly not to set Orpah and Ruth against each other. Although Orpah's name can mean the nap of the neck, the idea of Orpah walking away, it can also be something about cloud and water. In the same way, Ruth's name can mean saturation or satisfaction, fullness in some way. Both are connected in some way to water, and water is often a sign of life and life-giving. So these are not necessarily negative names here. What else did I want to say? Oh yes, it's kind of crazy the way that these 2 women of Orpah and Ruth are often set against each other, particularly in stories of conversion. So within the Jewish tradition, Ruth is seen as the model convert and is praised for that, and Orpah is kind of criticized for not converting to Judaism. But by the time we get to the medieval Christian readers, what happens? Ruth is praised for converting to Christianity, which of course is completely beyond the text, and Orpah is criticized for remaining a Jew, which again is complete nonsense when you read the text. So the way that we see these texts as stories of conversion, we also need to read attentive to that very fraught relationship that has taken place over the past between Christians and Jews in reading the Bible. All right then, so let's have our next reading from the book of Ruth, verses 16 to 14, and then we'll probably keep carrying on with them. So Ruth, chapter 1, 6 to 14.
Then she started to return with her daughter-in-laws from the country of Moab. For she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had had consideration for his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her.
Thank you. So the picture that I've got up on the screen is by the Chinese artist Heiki. What do you notice about that picture? What's going on there? Anybody want to offer a view, a perspective? Yeah, intertwined. So we have in the foreground Ruth and Naomi intertwined, but also turning slightly away Orpah there, but still connected, still held in that community. And you'll see on the floor the basket has 3 grains within it, 3 ears of grain, perhaps suggesting that this is that place of sharing bread, of sharing the journey together. This is a part of the story which is, as I wrote in the Bible Month magazine, soaked with kisses and tears. There is a real sense of loss and grief between the 3 women. Orpah is still here until verse 14. She's still part of the story. She is clearly loved and cared for by the other 2 women. And her loyalty, her loving kindness is praised by Naomi. Naomi, the way she talks, interestingly, begins by saying, giving quite a few kind of blessings to the 2 women. May God bless you, this kind of quite standard blessing. But then halfway through, she breaks off and the tone of the language changes. And she says directly to the 2 women, "Look, find husbands, survive." So there's a contrast here between that sense of God providing what we need for life, God blessing us, and God rewarding us, with a kind of sharp order to the 2 girls. You need to do what you need to do in order to survive. And what she doesn't say, but what is very obvious to us as, would have been obvious to the initial kind of readers or hearers of the text, is that Naomi is kind of reticent about Ruth and Orpah going with her because she knows that they won't be welcomed as foreign women. So that's part of the thing that is unspoken but very clear to everybody who read the text. Well, what about Orpah? She's heading out into the distance. What might we think about her? Well, certainly she's loyal. She's loyal to Naomi, and Naomi praises her. But then she's also loyal to her own mother's house, and that's the difference here. Ruth decides to stick with her mother-in-law. Orpah sticks with her mother and her own community. And that is something I feel should be praised a little bit more. So here we have an extract from a text by Musa Dube, who's a Botswanan feminist biblical scholar. She creates this lovely piece about imagining the discovery of the unpublished letters from Orpah to Ruth. What might they still be saying to each other if they're writing? Once they've separated, how might they still stay in touch? And I'll just read you a little bit from the final letter that Orpah writes to Ruth. I often wonder what became of you and Naomi in Bethlehem. Sometimes I wish I could see you. My daughter was named Ruth after you, for in this land you shall never be forgotten. When you have borne children, you should tell them stories of the Moabites, their origins, kindness, hospitality, and struggles for survival. These are the true words of Orpah, your eldest Moabite sister, the one who returned to her mother's house and to her gods. So perhaps an encouragement for us as preachers and leaders to value Orpah's choices and not to suggest they have to be set against or in contrast to the choice that Ruth makes. Let's hear a little bit more then from Ruth chapter 1. So if we could have verses 15 to 18, please.
So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her.
Thank you. This is perhaps the most familiar part of Ruth for many of us, and we'll come back to how we might read this passage in a moment. But I wanted to just mention, those of you who are looking at the screen will see that instead of the Lord, I've put up 4 letters, the divine name, which is often unspoken, but we might pronounce it as Yahweh if we were pronouncing it. I've put that up as a reminder to us that when we see the Lord in capital letters in our Bibles, that is not the word that is there. The word that is there in the Hebrew is the divine name, which is a play on the word to be, and talks about God as a God who is being, who creates, who is the beginning of everything, who will be and is and has been in all times. A much more lively, dynamic name for God than Lord, which we've got as a kind of stuck on for various reasons. So do think about thinking about how we name God as well within this text. What is this promise that Ruth makes to Naomi? We've got a number of different options, some of which you'll find more helpful than others. Perhaps this is a vow of loyalty. There's a similar vow that is made to David by one of David's companions in the army about committing to go with him, committing to support him, kind of have his back, so to speak. Perhaps it's a pledge of love, and certainly it's a text that is sometimes read out in marriage services, both marriage services between different sex, so heterosexual marriage services, and also same-sex marriage services. And it's had quite a strong history of being read as a commitment between 2 women, that perhaps is friendship, perhaps is family, but perhaps is signalling that these women are lovers. And that's a reading of the text that is, for me, beautiful and lovely and opens up that possibility of different relationships. So this is a text which may speak of LGBTQI couples, or we might sometimes that community is called the queer community or claims that name for themselves. So perhaps this is a pledge of love, a love that is different and is encouraging us to think differently about relationships. Now, you'll see that there's space for at least one more idea in my little square here on the screen. What would be the third idea? Well, perhaps a less helpful or less joyful reading of this text. It could be that this is a text that's a contract of survival. And by that I mean that Ruth, as a young woman who perhaps doesn't have a family to return to, she's a foreign woman, she is on the road about to enter into a place where she will be seen as a foreign woman, with an older woman who is established in that community. And she realizes if she's going to survive, she has to enslave herself to Naomi, offer her resources, which is both her physical work, but perhaps, as we'll see, her sexual work, and offer those to Naomi as a way of ensuring her survival. In this way, Naomi is someone who exploits in some way Ruth's youth, Ruth's possibilities to work, to have sex, to be used in that way in order to enable food to come into that household of Ruth and Naomi. So that's a bit more of a traumatic reading that we might feel a bit more ambivalent about. All right then, so let's have our final part from Ruth chapter 1, and then we'll probably whiz a little bit more quickly through Ruth chapter 2. So from verses 19 to 22, please.
So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned to go with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
Thank you. So here in this section, Naomi does a lot of denial. There's a lot of silence around Naomi, and for a long time, Naomi was judged very harshly about that. So she was seen, perhaps because of the way she identifies herself, as a bitter old woman who could no longer produce children, who had lost everything, who had no status or value, and who was kind of grumpy and mean to her daughters-in-law. Is that kind of a reading that you're familiar with, that you've kind of encountered, perhaps? But we might also read Naomi as a woman who has lost her husband and both her children, perhaps in traumatic circumstances, and has had to leave because of famine, and is then returning to a community that may judge her for leaving. And so here we might see Naomi as a woman who is grieving, who is lonely, who is afraid, who has come through some kind of trauma. And that might explain why she seems to often not respond well to Ruth. Certainly here, she denies that she even has a companion. She doesn't seem to, she's kind of keeps saying about how alone she is, even though Ruth is standing there with her. She denies her identity. No longer is she pleasant, but bitter. And she even denies that God is a God of plenty. So there's a kind of play in the Hebrew between this idea of God, the Almighty, that is sometimes a word for God that is connected to fertility and fullness, with the sense of Naomi feeling empty. So there's a whole heap of denial going on. Right, we've got to the end of chapter 1. So we'll move through chapter 2. If that's okay, I'm looking to Adrian, who I can't see. Or I think we'll carry on, if that's okay, maybe for another 15 minutes or so, for those of you who are watching on the streaming as well. So let's hear from Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 to 7.
Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favour. She said to her, Go, my daughter. So she went. She came and she gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, The Lord be with you. They answered, The Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, To whom does this young woman belong? The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, She is the Moabite, who came from Naomi, from the country of Moab. She said, Please, let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment.
So in chapter 2, or as I've called it, the book of Boaz, where we move from conversations that primarily take place between the three women, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, and into a more public space, I suppose, the space where Boaz encounters Ruth. And each of the chapters of chapters 2 and 3 are primarily focused on an encounter between Ruth and Boaz. But both chapters are framed by the encounter or the time in the private space between Ruth and Naomi. So Ruth and Naomi talk about what to do. Ruth goes and does it. Then she comes back and reports back to Naomi. And that's the kind of pattern we get in both these middle chapters. We get here a really clear encounter with this law around the gleaning rules and what is left over, and how those who are vulnerable, who live in the margins, not necessarily only of the field but in society, are invited or enabled to glean for what is left over. This also perhaps connects with some of our own experiences of encountering or knowing of or receiving the benefits of those people who work in the margins of our own societies. And I'm thinking particularly of seasonal workers, migrant workers, who for a long time we have invited over to pick our crops, our fruit, potatoes, often working in cold, hard conditions for hours on end, unstable, little pay, little protection, and yet vital to our economy and food system. Now, we know that, again, this is a time when we are facing big questions as a society about how we respond to our relationship with communities that have come and worked for us in our fields. And perhaps an underlying theme of this text and our own conversations is that of racism and xenophobia, because within the text, when Boaz asks, "Who is this woman?" what he is told is, she is a foreigner from a foreign land. She is a Moabite from Moab. She's a foreigner from a foreign place. And that's all he can see, really. That's the primary way in which he sees her. This image, perhaps from a contemporary Israeli photographer, also sums up that sense of the hard work of gleaning, of living off the waste or what is overlooked by those who have more than you. And certainly this is an image that we could see in many parts of the world, including within our own countries and contexts. And this image reminds us of the vulnerability of both Ruth and Naomi as they seek to gather from the floor enough grain to live off. But perhaps what isn't so visible, but we need to name, is that Boaz is also potentially vulnerable within this situation. What do we know about Boaz? Well, his name, first of all, it's a play on it's a connection to the pillars of the temple. So Boaz means really, quite literally, a pillar of society. That's his kind of, the way he's introduced. And many of the ways in which he's characterized are similar. He is seen as religious. He's seen as someone who knows what's going on, is very present within the community, is a civic leader. He wants to do well. Much of the way that he speaks and interacts is about maintaining that public role that he has. He wants to be seen as a good civil leader, a good member of the civic society. And that is no bad thing. There's no need to suggest that he is being insincere in those desires, although there may be other desires playing alongside. So we'll continue to see how Boaz develops as a character as we move on. So let's have our next part of the chapter from Ruth, chapter 2, 8 to 16, please. Thank you. Verses 8 to 16.
Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate, with her face to the ground, and said to him, "Why have you found favor in your sight? Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her."
This part of chapter 2 very clearly sums up a common theme within the book of Ruth, which is, although God is invoked and asked for blessing and asked to demonstrate loving kindness or hesed, it tends to be the characters, the human characters, who actually enact those blessings. So we have here Boaz offering a blessing to Ruth, that God may provide for her and protect her, really may give her grain and shelter. And yet, immediately, Boaz himself takes on that responsibility and begins to provide her here with grain, later on with shelter. And there's a play that goes along this and the next chapter on the idea of wings, God's wings being a place of refuge. And the word wing is also linked to the word blanket or shawl or cloak. So we'll see that more clearly in the next chapter. Well, what I wanted to suggest also here is that this passage closely links into some work by Elsa Tamez, who is a Mexican feminist theologian and biblical scholar, who's one of my favorite authors and writers. She talks about God as bread love, or amor pan in the Spanish. And she talks about how we encounter a God who hungers for justice, who hungers for the bread to be given to all, who hungers for a world in which love is there for all people. And she says, if we encounter a situation where there is not enough bread or not enough love, that is a sign that things have gone wrong, that situation is not how God wants it to be, because God is a God who is fundamentally a God we can name as bread love, a God who desires good things for us and for all people. Okay, so again, encouragement for you to encounter Elsa Tamaz's work if you haven't already. She particularly, her writing on the book of James is very accessible. She's kind of a good piece to begin with. So let's conclude from Ruth chapter 2, verses 17 to 23.
So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. She picked it up and came into the town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gleaned. Then she took out and gave her what was left over after she herself had been satisfied. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The name of the man with whom I worked today is Boaz." And then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay close by my servants until they have finished all my harvest.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. Otherwise you might be bothered in another field." So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
So this is the moment where the scene shifts from the public space in the field back to the private space of Ruth and Naomi's conversation at the end of the day, and their continued planning for how things will work out for them, how they will manage to get enough grain to eat. I think here it might be worth us mentioning about some of the ways in which Boaz and Naomi both seek in some ways to protect Ruth or to set boundaries for her. So both of them say, don't go into the unknown fields, stay with another group of workers. Boaz suggests staying with, she says that he tells her to stay with his young men. Naomi suggests that she stays with the young women. And Boaz says earlier in the chapter to the young men working in the field, do not bother Ruth, but actually the word is do not assault or molest Ruth. So here we have a case where Ruth as a young woman is required to modify her behavior in order to escape sexual violence. And the question for us might be, is it Ruth's behavior that needs to change? Or is it that we need to be using this text as a way of speaking about who is vulnerable within our community and whose behavior and assumptions needs to change in order that those people are not vulnerable? So a question to take into our preaching here may be, what might Ruth have to teach us about seeking justice for ourselves and for others? How do we acknowledge those broad social and cultural inequalities and injustices that make certain people more vulnerable than others? And how can we challenge those as preachers? Final slide before we break. Just a mention back to this idea of the Redeemer. Through the whole of the Bible, we have the image of God as the Redeemer overall. It is God who redeems and saves us. And yet, redemption as a kind of notion, as an activity, is very much rooted in those practical tasks of restoring what is lost, whether that is loss of a relative to debt and enslavement or loss of land through debt. There are responsibilities here that I referenced earlier. Interestingly, in Ruth, this idea of redeeming or restoring is used more intensively than anywhere else in the Bible. So this is very much at the heart of what Ruth is about, the notion of redeeming. And as I've already mentioned, it's often humans who do that redemptive work, and not always the humans we expect it to be. So it turns out that Boaz has there is a closer next of kin to Ruth than Boaz, as we'll see in the next chapter. And yet Boaz is the one who ends up redeeming the land. And it turns out that it will be Obed, who is yet to be born, who redeems Naomi's name from being forgotten. So redemption coming from unexpected places, perhaps. Okay, well, somehow we've managed to get to 20 to 12. Shall we have 15 minutes? Yep, so that would bring us to 5 to 12. That was a quick maths there. 5 to 12, 11:55, we'll come back and we'll continue with chapters 3 and 4. Thank you. Yep, lovely. Okay, so are we ready? Are we up streaming, etc.? Still people coming back, but we're streaming. So shall we make a start? Adrian, you can gather those. Okay, well. Welcome back. Just over coffee here in Salisbury, we were talking about the fact that there's quite a lot in this text, perhaps more than we expect initially. And a number of the themes that I'm picking out are ones that I explore, maybe not in that much more space, but a little bit more space within the Bible Month magazine. So if you kind of thought, oh gosh, that felt like quite a lot to take on board, then have a look at the Bible Month magazine and there's more stuff there. So we're moving on to the second session this morning, which I've entitled What We Owe to Each Other, Redemption and Restoration in Ruth. And I particularly wanted to make reference to a television programme that some of you may have seen. Have any of you watched The Good Place? Okay, a couple, yeah, so at least one. So this is, without any spoilers, The Good Place is a story about, that begins with a woman who wakes up and realises that she's died and she's gone to the good place. It's a comedy, but it includes a lot of different ideas about philosophy and ethics. One of the other people who has also died and gone to the good place is an ethics professor. And for various reasons, he is tasked with trying to teach ethics to a few of the other characters. And I wanted to read a little bit from what the professor, Chidi Anakonye, says about ethics, about his kind of understanding of ethics. So this is a little quote from him in his role as Professor of Ethics. So why do it then? Why choose to be good every day if there is no guaranteed reward we can count on now or in the afterlife? I argue that we choose to be good because of our bonds with other people and our innate desire to treat them with dignity. Simply put, we are not in this alone. That sense of bonds with other people, about the idea of not being in this alone, about the idea that we owe each other something, is very central to the book of Ruth and something that we see how the book explores. So questions we might ask are, what in this part of the book do Ruth and Naomi and Boaz owe to each other, not only from the law, but from other kind of senses of their responsibilities towards each other? And how does the book of Ruth help us to pay attention to our own commitments, what we owe to those others within our lives, both known and unknown? And as I've already said, what space is there for going beyond what is owed? So not just what we need to do in order to fulfill our duty, but how do we go beyond what we owe to each other? So we'll move on then to chapter 3, which I've entitled The Book of Ruth, because Ruth certainly is a central character in this chapter. One of the ways that I've already flagged up how we could read the book of Ruth is as a carnival-esque story. And here I'm drawing on the work of a scholar called Nehama Ashkenazi and her article that she wrote in 2007. She's not the only person who has this kind of way of understanding the book of Ruth, but she's the one whose work I've primarily drawn from. She talks about how Ruth fits the description of a carnival tale or a story about a folk tale that is concerned with carnival themes. She notes how there are moments of celebration, festival, the barley harvest. There's also kind of wildness and jokes and defiance throughout, although sometimes we don't always see them. She talks about how comic folk tales are often about the survival of the poor and are contrasted here in Ruth with some of the kind of more ponderous debate over the legal codes. We have Boaz, who is the pillar of society, you'll remember, who talks a lot at length about what he should do. He's very ponderous in the way that he talks. He talks at length, he talks much longer than most of the other characters, and it's full of kind of back and forth, kind of almost internal debates. He's not quite sure what the right thing to do is, and he's trying to explore it. And this is set against the very sharp words that Ruth particularly, but also to a lesser extent Naomi talks, which are all about getting to the point because they need to survive. They haven't got time for big debates. They just need to get what they need to survive. So that contrast between the poor who don't have time to speak at length and the wealthy or well-established who have time to debate at leisure. There's also within such comic folk tales often a focus on the basic things of life, things that are shared by all humans, a need to eat, a need to drink, a need to sleep, getting drunk, having sex, all those kind of things which, whether you're rich or poor, you can still be involved in and will still impact you no matter whether you're rich or poor, the same. And in this particular reading, a focus is on how Ruth is often a story that is about overturning order. So in this chapter in particular, we have Ruth proposing something, whether it's marriage or not is unclear, but something at least to Boaz. Ruth approaches Boaz. Ruth makes a proposition of some kind. She's the one who does that, whereas normally we would expect Boaz to be doing that movement. That would be what we would assume. Lots of boundary crossing. Not only Ruth steps into Boaz's field, but Ruth and Naomi and Orpah have all stepped across national boundaries, and then there's boundary crossing in terms of what's assumed to be good behaviour or not. So something there which you may or may not find helpful. If this is a story that is a comedy and a story that has a lot of mockery in it, the question might be, who is being mocked? And I think perhaps Boaz is the one who is most likely to be mocked in some way. But maybe gently, in a gentle way, this upstanding citizen or pillar of society is shown to be someone who is most concerned with public appearances. We never really know what's in Boaz's heart. We know what he feels he should do, and he talks about that at great length. The Hebrew in which he speaks is rambling, is old-fashioned, is kind of stiff and unwielding. It's very different to the Hebrew in which Ruth and Naomi speak in. But the text isn't necessarily being wholly negative on Boaz. Perhaps it's saying that he's been played as a fool rather than being a fool himself. And perhaps it's also just pointing out that as someone with resources, he might expect to be not taken advantage of, but used to enable the survival of those who have no resources. Let's hear then from the chapter 3 of Ruth, the first 5 verses. So Ruth 3, 1-5. Thank you.
Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you, so that it may be well with you. Now, here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do."
Once again, this chapter begins with Ruth and Naomi making plans. So they've had a plan about gleaning, but then the time of the harvest has come to an end. They're getting hungry. What do? They look around to see what possibilities for survival are around them. They see Boaz and they decide they need him for their survival. If we were reading or hearing these few verses in any other context but the Bible, we would know very clearly what Ruth was being asked to do. There would be no getting away from it. Yet somehow, because it's in the biblical text, we shy away from naming what's going on. Ruth is being asked to prepare herself to sleep with Boaz. Now, whether she does or not, the text is ambiguous, but certainly that is what she has been required to do. This is a young foreign woman who is poor and vulnerable. She has been asked by an older woman to prepare herself, bathe and anoint herself in order to go and have sex with an older, wealthy man. That is the reality of the text. And that is the reality also of Esther. And this is where Ruth and Esther very much overlap. Similar words, similar pattern, and similar use of a young woman's body that is used sexually in order to ensure the survival of both the woman and a wider community. That's not to say that Ruth doesn't have any agency here, but we have to question how much she has a choice, whether she chooses to go ahead with the plan or not, whether she recognizes that's the only way for her to be able to eat or not. This is not a safe story. This is a story about exploitation, about power inequality, about the need for some women and men to sell their bodies in some way or another in order to eat. And that we need to name, because if we can't name that in the text, how can we name it in the reality of our own churches and communities where things like this continue to happen? So, a question to here might be, what might the book of Ruth help us to speak of? What things that we find difficult to name within our churches might Ruth help us to speak of? Let's hear the next few verses, chapter 3, verses 6 to 13. Thank you.
So she went down to the threshing floor and did as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came quietly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do so. If he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then, as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning."
This is a part of Ruth that rarely gets read in our churches. And again, perhaps this is something we need to learn from. Why is it that we find it difficult to talk about sex within our churches, and what needs to change so that we can have good and positive conversations about sex and sexual desire, rather than those being suppressed and often ending up in problematic relationships and problematic tales of abuse. So here Ruth approaches the feet of Boaz. And I wanted us to pay a few minutes, to spend a few minutes looking at this image by Marc Chagall. Again, maybe just chat with your neighbour. What is it you see in the image? What do you notice about it? And we'll gather a couple of comments from there. Comments on the picture. We have a microphone, thank you. Okay, so a couple of comments. What do people see in the image? So this is Marc Chagall's interpretation of this scene. It may be different to your interpretation. What do you notice? What strikes you?
Well, it seems to me that
Just wait to the mic.
Sorry. It just seems to me that the two people take a minor part in this picture, and that the important bit is the food.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll come back to that, but that's a great observation. The food dominates, doesn't it? Even in the light. So although the moon, in some ways, one commenter mentions, the moon reflects Ruth's breasts. So there's a kind of connection there between where the points of light are in the picture. But most of the focus, central, dominant, is the grain. We'll come back to that in a moment. Anything else? Yeah, at the back there.
Ruth's expression struck me. It's a kind of almost expression of trepidation, of worry, of concern, as you would expect. It's not one of comfort and one of feeling like she's safe. Yeah,
thank you. Boaz is happily kind of slumped out, isn't he? And there's Ruth, perhaps about to make a move, perhaps having made her move, we're not sure. But yeah, she seems more alert, awake, looking beyond the relationship at this point, looking beyond her immediate connection or interaction with Boaz to something that is happening beyond that. So that's, again, a really helpful observation. Okay, well, let's pick up on that point about the grain then. If Ruth is primarily a story about food, about being empty or satisfied, we shouldn't overlook that Boaz is described as lying down at the end of the heap of grain. Perhaps what Ruth is searching for in the darkness isn't the body of Boaz, but is the heap of grain. Perhaps she's gone looking for the grain, the food, and she stumbles over Boaz in the middle and thinks, okay, this is the man who lies literally between me and my next meal. So I need to engage with him in order to be able to have that grain. That's what she's got her eye on. Then we might ask, who is vulnerable in this context? Is Boaz being played and exploited, or is Ruth continuing to be vulnerable because of the reality that she is a young woman in a public space with lots of drunk men? So where's the vulnerability? And we might say that both are vulnerable in their own ways, and we shouldn't overlook the vulnerabilities of either. Boaz perhaps is vulnerable in terms of his social status, and Ruth is vulnerable on a whole heap of different levels in terms of her sexual and physical well-being, as well as her position within the society in which she's only just entered into. We see here also reference to the wings. So in the text we have, I am Ruth, your servant, spread your cloak over your servant. And the word for cloak is associated with the word for wings. So is Ruth asking Boaz to fulfill the blessing he has put upon her about God providing refuge and protection? God's wings, is it a play on that? Or is it about marriage? Is it spread your wings over me, protect me? Is it simply about sex? Because wings might be linked into some kind of sexual reference here. Or is it literally, I'm cold, let me come under your blanket? There's lots of different possibilities there. And again, we might want to hold all of those possibilities open within the text. What Ruth gives Boaz here is an idea, an opportunity for him to figure out how he's going to take this situation forward. So Ruth starts to plant ideas within him in this conversation. And as we'll see, those ideas are played out by Boaz. Boaz is transformed here from someone who lives very much within the rules of society to someone who is given an insight into how to get around the rules, particularly the rules about not marrying foreign women that would have been dominant at the time that the story is written. So he's kind of thinking, okay, if I want to be with Ruth for whatever reason, how am I going to get round those rules and those assumptions about society? And Ruth offers him a kind of idea about how he will take that forward, as we'll see in the next chapter. Let's have then the final 4 verses from chapter 3, if possible. So Ruth 3, verses 14 to 18, please.
So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize another. For he said, "It must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Then he said, "Bring the cloak you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back. Then he went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, "How did things go with you, my daughter?" Then she told her all the man had done for her, saying, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, 'Do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today."
Okay. This image from Rembrandt, one of 3 drawings of Ruth that we have from Rembrandt, demonstrates this moment where Boaz is pouring the grain into Ruth's cloak. And the cloak suggests a connection, an ongoing union between the 2 characters. They're much more equal, perhaps, here than in the Chagall picture that we saw. And we also can see how Ruth will pick up the grain, and before she puts it on her back, it will be a bump in front of her, symbolizing the pregnancy that she will go on to have. So this heap of grain becomes a heap that represents the child she will then have and bear for Naomi. The question is asked 3 times of Ruth, "Who are you?" Her identity is slippery. Boaz, in chapter 2, asks his servant, "To whom does this young woman belong? Where is she from? How does she fit in?" And the servant answers in no uncertain terms, "She is a Moabite from Moab. She is a foreigner from foreign places." Kind of a rejection, a response that is about rejection. And then Boaz asks the woman in the dark, "Who are you? Who are you, such a bold woman, to come here at night to meet with me in this public place? Who are you? how will I get to know you? Or who are you to me? Are you doing this because you are a friend or a foe? Are you going to slit my throat or drive a tent peg through my head like Jael did? And the scene echoes something of that, a woman approaching a drunk man. There's something there of that story also. Or are you someone who will be friendly towards me, sexually and otherwise? And then what we miss within the New Revised Standard Version is that Naomi asks Ruth also the same question. So in verse 16, it says that Naomi says, "How did things go with you, my daughter?" But actually the Hebrew is, "Who are you?" But the translators think, well, this doesn't make sense because surely Naomi knows who Ruth is. But what's underlying that question is, who are you now following this night? It's not a question about Ruth's virginity because Ruth's already been married. So it's not saying, are you still a virgin? How do I see you as a sexual being? But she is asking, are you now Boaz's betrothed? Who are you? Are you now Boaz's betrothed? Has it gone well, the plan? Or, who are you? Are you still my Ruth? Will you still cling to me, even if you have managed to get Boaz? Will there still be a place for me in your home? So a number of questions asking, who are you? Right then, so chapter 4, our last chapter, the book of Naomi. And we'll have someone read the first 8 verses, please. Thank you, Adrian. So Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 to 8.
No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there than the next of kin, of whom Boaz had spoken, came passing by. So Boaz said, "Come over, friend, sit down here." And he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. He then said to the next of kin, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belongs to our kinsman Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, so that I may know, for there is no one prior to you to redeem it, and I come after you." So he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also acquiring Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance." At this, the next of kin said, "I cannot redeem it for myself without damaging my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, one party took off a sandal and gave it to the others. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, "Acquire it for yourself," he took off his sandal.
This is a scene quite different from some of the other scenes we have encountered so far in the book. It's a scene that is primarily a conversation between men, whereas we've had primarily conversations between women. And it reminds us that the decision-making power, the formal decision-making power, is held by the men or the elders of the city. They are the ones who are invited to sit down repeatedly, sit down, until enough of them have gathered to be able to make a formal legal decision. Boaz is working within this context, within the very formal civic, social rules of that particular society. But his encounter with Ruth has also made him aware of the fact that he's going to have to work extra hard to get things to fall as he wants them to. And I hesitate saying that because I'm actually never sure what Boaz actually wants. But certainly as things need to in order for Ruth and Naomi to survive. Even though Naomi has this land, she obviously has either not been able to work it because she's been away, or she has the land but it's been unproductive, or she has it now but she doesn't have enough resources to pay for others to work the land to provide food for her. So she's got the land, but she can't make use of it, and that's why she needs Boaz to come in and help. It's the land that the men are interested in a lot more than Ruth. And again, what's unstated, it's stated here by Boaz, is that Ruth is a Moabite. And he kind of almost throws that in as a warning shot against the other men. So the land's of interest to the Redeemer, but not Ruth the Moabite, who brings a whole series of problems with her in his eyes. There's confusion, though, because it's not true that if the Redeemer takes and redeems the land, he has to also marry Ruth. That's not the case within the law. But that's the suggestion that Boaz makes to kind of confuse the situation. And to do this in a very public way, so that not only are things changing, so the Redeemer says yes, then no, Boaz can step in and appear like he's done the right thing by this woman. He's been the one who has restored the land. It also sets up the Redeemer as someone who is of no value to society. And actually his name in Hebrew means so-and-so. He's not really named. He's given a name that isn't a name. So-and-so, the one who didn't act, the one who didn't redeem the land, the one who failed as a redeemer. So he's a redeemer, but he's so-and-so because he doesn't really have the authority or action to actually end up with a name. Which again is a play on the fact that he's concerned about his own name, and yet the text never records his name. What else? So many other things that we might say about this, but I think we'll just move on a little bit to the next few verses. So verses 9 to 12, please, Adrian. Thank you.
Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I've acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses." Sorry, how far?
Until the next two verses as well, please.
Sorry. Then all the people who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah."
Generally, this text is read as the moment of the public marriage ceremony. There's witnesses, there's statements of intention, etc. Note that the person who doesn't say anything is Ruth. Ruth never gets a chance to say whether she's okay with what's happening. But the assumption here is that Boaz and Ruth marry at this moment, and the community bears witness to them. Even though Boaz says that his intention for marrying and redeeming the land is to restore and uphold the names of the three men who have died, as we'll see, that's not what happens. The child is not named for any of those men, and the men disappear. So again, ironies that are present within the text. What Boaz says he's going to do and his intention doesn't actually match what happens. And then we have the first of these blessings, a blessing that is made by the people and the elders to Ruth, although she's only referred as the woman who is coming into your house and as this young woman. Is this actually a blessing, though? It's a very odd blessing. It's a blessing that mentions some odd characters within the Bible. And there are other characters that we'll come back to that are perhaps alluded through it. So the blessing mentions Rachel and Leah. Well, what do we know about Rachel and Leah? We know they had plenty of children, but we also know they had a difficult relationship as sisters and were often set against each other. So there is conflict there, both amongst the women and amongst the sons that they have, leading on to other stories. And then there's mention of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Do we know where that story comes from? Anyone? Well, there is a Tamar who is raped. You are correct. It's not that Tamar, although it's no coincidence that the two women are named the same. So this is a story from Genesis. It's one of my favourite stories, that and Cain and Abel, so you'll kind of see where, where my heart lies. So it's a story about Judah, who you remember is one of the brothers of Joseph, who turns away from his family, so kind of echoes there of Elimelech turning away from his home, and he goes and spends time with his friends somewhere else, and marries, well, he has 3 sons, and one of them is married to this foreign woman called Tamar. But the first son dies without having a child, and then the second son dies, and then Judah is concerned that his third son will die, so he sends Tamar away. Does this story becoming familiar to you? Yes, okay, right, so some of you might remember this. So then Tamar realizes that she's kind of stuck. She hasn't got any security within the household, and she needs to find a way to secure herself for her own well-being as she grows older. She needs to have a son, or she needs to have a child. So the text is a bit confused about what happens, but basically Judah mistakes her for a sex worker. Now, whether Tamar is trying to pretend to be a sex worker is unclear, but Judah, her father-in-law, has sex with her. And the result of that tale, amongst other things, is that she has twins, Perez and Zereth, who are the twins, who fight coming out of the womb. And Perez, the name Perez means breach. So if someone blesses you and says, "May you be like 2 sisters who fought and argued and whose children fought and argued. May you be like a woman who had sex with her father-in-law after her 2 husbands died, and have a child who argued even as he was coming out of the womb with his brother." Would that be a blessing or not? Let's think about that. So it could be a mocking blessing. It could be a blessing that is actually more of a curse, that this will be a breach, that Naomi and Ruth and Boaz have done something terrible by enabling a marriage between a Moabite and an Israelite. But it could be that the people and the elders are quite impressed with Ruth and Naomi and say, "Well done. Like these other trickster characters, you managed to get what you needed to survive." And we recognise that. Of course, here you'll see that these are the same names that appear one way or another in other parts of the Bible, particularly in Matthew's genealogy. So I've mentioned Rahab, which is the first woman that we encounter within the genealogy of Jesus in the beginning of Matthew. Rahab isn't mentioned, but the fact that this instance takes place at the city walls, the city gate, is a reminder of Rahab, who inhabits that wall space. She lives within the city walls, doesn't she? And then we have Tamar, who is also mentioned. We have Ruth, who is there. And then I'm forgetting, the next one, the other one we have is the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. She's the 4th woman who's mentioned in the genealogy. So 4 women who are mentioned in the story that leads with Mary having Jesus as a child. The only 4 women who are mentioned are all women who have been placed in difficult circumstances in terms of their sexual activity, and most of them are foreign. So what's the text doing? It's setting up the fact that Mary's relationship and sexual activity is unusual and problematic in some way, yet she's in a good long tradition of women who have similarly had to make the best of the situations they found themselves in. So Mary, as an unmarried mother, is set alongside these 4 other women who similarly act out of what the situation they're in. All right, so the final few verses then. We've got Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 to 22, please.
So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David.
Thank you. So we end with a genealogy, which perhaps might have even been the start of this story. Sometimes genealogies are the prompts for stories to be told, and other times they're the linking spaces between the different stories. And here, this is where the book of Ruth is connected in very clearly to the story of David. And yet, note again, it's not David who is central to this genealogy in some ways. It's Perez. Perez is mentioned twice here. And has already been mentioned once before in the chapter. So we might then draw from that some conclusions about how the story views Ruth becoming part of Judah, Ruth the Moabite becoming part of Judah. Against other stories which suggest that Ruth has no place, the book of Ruth suggests that Ruth as a Moabite has no place in the community. The book of Ruth suggests there is a place for Ruth and others like her, other foreign women, who bring gifts and graces into the community. Some scholars suggest that Ruth is kind of consumed within the society, and her Moabiteness, her own identity, is lost, and see that as problematic. But for others, the fact that she is celebrated here so clearly suggests that what is being said is that difference and otherness brings strength and gifts into a community. And certainly this fits with the thrice mention of Perez. If we're thinking about Perez as breach, perhaps what the text is saying to us is every community has breaches, has fault lines, has things that happen unexpectedly, and new insights and gifts that come in through them. Okay, so we've got to the end of the text. I've got a few slides about the figure of God, who we haven't talked much about. So we'll look at those few slides, if that's okay. And then we'll have a pause for a couple of minutes of questions from the group in Salisbury, and then with a reminder that we'll come back to questions later on in the afternoon. So, a question for you to consider. Who is God in Ruth? What kind of God do we encounter in Ruth? What does God do? Or how is God perceived? Maybe have a quick chat with your neighbour about that, and then we'll gather some thoughts. Comments about that question. Who is God? What does God do? How is God described or understood? What kind of God do we encounter in Ruth, as the text tells us? And we've got a microphone, so just pop your hand up and then we'll get the microphone to you.
There seem to be two contradictory threads. On the one hand, God had mercy on his people and provided food again in the land, and God blessed their union, so the child was born. On the other hand, all the time, it's the human beings taking action to achieve things that are happening. So I think it's quite conflicted.
So there's a tension there about who does what, and how do humans work with God? How does God work through humans? And where is God absent? And humans are perceived to step into the breach or not. So some questions there. Okay, thank you. A couple of others. Yep, at the back there. Thank you.
We were saying that God is a behind-the-scenes God in Ruth, and a God who works through people, or people doing the thing that God wants them to potentially do in caring for each other, and not a God who works through the miraculous, through big displays like in lots of the other narratives of the Old Testament.
Yeah, this is very much an everyday tale, isn't it? And perhaps a story about everyday faith and an everyday God who is concerned for this little story, this little community, these things of basic human need. And yet, as you say, not perhaps a God that is more behind the scenes, or as we might say, in the wings, than we're used to seeing within other parts of the Bible. Let's see where I got to. So something echoing this point at the front about God who gives bread and babies, but also God who takes those same things. So if we think about the bread and the babies coming from God, we must also recognize that the text suggests God takes away the bread, leading to famine, and the babies, or in this case, the sons who die. So if we want to place God in there, God both gives and takes. God is invoked both as a curse and a blessing. So Naomi's experience of God in her loss and grief and trauma is about a God who is unhelpful, ungiving, who is destructive. And yet Boaz's experience of God in his position of stability and provision and satisfaction reflects a God who also provides generously. So once again, as preachers, we might want to negotiate our way between those. How does our own life shape how we understand God in it? God is one who protects and provides, and we'll come back to those in the next slide. But also God is one who chooses. God's chosen people, and then Ruth chooses certainly to come back with Naomi and to choose that God also. So as we've already mentioned, God is, as we say, in the wings. Only twice is it suggested that God does something directly. Most of the time it's people talking about God and then enacting the blessings that they see are coming from God themselves, particularly in the case of Boaz. We could read that as God stepping back to let humans act and for God valuing human activity. That's one reading. We could always also read it as a question to God. Why doesn't God step in to save these women? Why do they have to act on their own? And this is a story we encounter elsewhere. So here, as in the story of Esther and the story of Tamar, what is striking is that God doesn't act, but it's actually Ruth in this case who acts, and Naomi, and then Boaz as needs be. And two images for us to kind of take away: the God who spreads God's wings, or who enables others to spread their wings and provide refuge, and the God who is linked to bread, the bread love God. All of those coming together in this word hesed, God's steadfast love and loving kindness that we encounter so much in the prophetic text, here lived out very clearly by the different characters. All four characters in some ways demonstrate hesed, loving kindness, steadfast love. And in that way, perhaps we can see them as reflecting something of God. So our last slide then. How might we read Ruth today for ourselves? We might read Ruth as a story that offers us the hope of repair and reconciliation in times of division. And we are certainly living in a time of division and brokenness at the moment. So what does Ruth say about restoring and reconciling communities that have fallen out, families that have been broken, bringing those back together? In context of increasing inequality, Ruth perhaps encourages us to have resilience in the struggle against injustice and to recognise that resilience is something that many people have to have if they are to survive. How, as a church, do we support those who are vulnerable, who are facing injustice, poverty, and violence? And similarly, how does Ruth speak about the need to resist violence, to name it, to be not afraid of naming it in the text and in our lives, and to be clear that we must resist it? All those things, repair, resilience, and resistance, perhaps to come together in the central theme of Ruth, which is that of redemption. How does Ruth demonstrate the ways in which we can work with God to bring about redemption in our own lives and to restore the sacred texts and connections of our own lives? Okay, that's the whole slide. So we have got maybe for some questions and comments from Salisbury, and then we're going to come back later on, aren't we, Adrian, with some more questions that people are going to either text or send in and come back at that point.
3 o'clock, we will start with the next Q&A session. But we do just have a few minutes now if there are any questions here that we'd like to ask. And I also have a question from Surrey.
You glossed over entirely the fact that Naomi seems to end up with Obed and that he's seen as Naomi's child, not as Ruth's child.
Yeah.
So what have you got to say about that?
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why it's interesting to test out how the book feels if we called it, for example, the Book of Naomi. Because you're right, the book ends primarily concerned with Naomi's well-being and her status as a mother to Obed, rather than Ruth. So it's Naomi that is celebrated and lifted up in the community. And there's lots of ways we can see that. We can see that about probably the way it's designed is about a restoration of her 2 lost sons. Just as in the book of Job, we get that kind of restoration that isn't really a restoration because she's still living with the grief of her 2 lost sons, even if she now has a grandchild who isn't really her grandchild at all, is nothing actually biologically to do with her, but is still placed within her in her arms. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Rachel, maybe the next question from Surrey would just follow on nicely from that. Jewishness comes through the mother. How does this work with Ruth, who is a Gentile?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not sure how at what point the notion of Jewish identity coming through the mother emerged. So I'm not sure if that's always been the case. I confess I just don't know. But certainly in the Jewish tradition, Ruth is taken as the idea of, as the convert. So she is seen as a convert to the Jewish faith rather than someone who inherits it through her own identity. And she is seen as the one who kind of is almost the threefold questioning of Ruth can be seen as the threefold questioning that sometimes happens within people who are seeking to convert to Judaism. I confess that my only example that I can think of is the one that happens in Sex and the City. I don't know if any of you watched that, but Charlotte wants to convert to Judaism and she goes to see the rabbi and she keeps knocking on the door and he opens the door, sees her and shuts the door. And it takes 3 times before he's willing to see her. And that's a kind of sense of people have to really want to convert before the community will take them seriously and help them to do that. So there's themes there around religious identity and how we get there, whether it's through birth or through struggle and conversion. Does that answer the question okay, Adrian? Is that okay?
I think so.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
There one more question? Not for now. So You do have my number, 077 999 00476. And you're welcome to text any questions for this afternoon's Q&A session through to that, or else just to put them at the bottom of the Facebook or the YouTube feed, and we'll pick them up from there. Okay. We're going to break now. We're going to have lunch and then the afternoon session, and then at 3 o'clock, we will be back together for the Q&A session. And we hope you'll join us all then. Okay? Can you hear me? Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to people all over the country who are streaming in as well. Good to be back on time. I've got about 8 or 9 questions in front of me that we've been sent, and I'm going to allow Rachel to be grilled. So the first question, I think it came from Guernsey, was to ask with some concern, what happened to the sandal? Did it? Does the sandal get given as a permanent pledge, or does the person get it back?
Well, there's a lot of debate around what the sandal symbolises and whether sandals were actually used in this way or not, whether this is just a kind of little fantasy about the sandals being used. But it seems to be that the sandal is supposed to represent that the person wants to be excused from the situation. So it's a sign of, I'm kind of throwing in the towel, I'm throwing in the sandal, so to speak. I don't know quite where the sandal ends up, but I presume it ends up back on the foot of the person who it comes from.
At some point.
And another reading is that it's some kind of sexual reference. So there's some kind of sense that it's perhaps alluding to some kind of sexual, it's a sexual reference in some way. Yeah.
Thank you. In Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 to 18 and 20 to 21, the formatting in the NRSV indicates that it's poetry or a hymn. Mm-hmm. Is there something to say about that?
Yeah, well, we find we find within the Bible that there are some books of the Bible that are wholly written in poetic form, others where we move back and forth, particularly blessings or vows or hymns or songs of victory may be written in poetry. So this here fits, for example, like the song that Moses and Miriam sing in Exodus as a kind of interruption, a break, a pause to the narrative where there's suddenly things become poetic and have that feature to them. What does that mean for our interpretation? Well, I suppose it reminds us that this particular part is even more open, more suggestive of space and possibility than even the rest of the narrative. And it is good to remember that the key feature of Hebrew poetry is parallelism or repetition. So we get that, for example, where you go, I will go, where you lodge, I will lodge. So there's repetition across the line, but then between the two lines as well. Similar kind of sense of being together, of staying with someone is reflected on in both lines. Your people shall be my people, your God shall be my God. So that kind of commitment to community, commitment to belonging to a particular community. So some sense of repetition that we get over the lines where the same idea is said in a number of different ways. we get that very much in the Psalms, but also the prophets as well, which are parallel texts. But yeah, I think it just adds to the richness of it, really.
Thank you. How significant is the contrast between Naomi, who remains resolutely foreign in Moab and returns to Bethlehem at the first opportunity, and on the other hand, Ruth, who embraces the Jewish garden community?
That's a great question, and I don't know. The texts obviously come from the Jewish Judah community, the community and people that identify with the land of Judah. So there's a sense of a pulling back, a calling back. And if we think of this as a post-exilic text, a text that is written most likely after the experience of being away in exile in Babylon, it kind of makes sense that at the first opportunity, Naomi, in this case perhaps representing the people who've been sent into exile in Babylon, rushes back home. And there was a feeling that some people had got a little bit too used to the life in Babylon and didn't want to go home. So some texts were written around this time to persuade people to come home. So parts of Isaiah, for example, were encouraging the community to return home. And perhaps there's a kind of aspect of that within the book of Ruth. And it makes sense that Ruth is encompassed within the community as well and doesn't return to her own land. And again, that fits with texts like in Isaiah, in the third part, the final part of Isaiah, where there's this valuing of the foreigner and the eunuch and all those who have a kind of righteous heart and a pureness of spirit are welcome to worship in the temple. So a suggestion that the community needs to be open to difference and be willing to hold that. Okay, again, I'm answering the questions and the people who've asked them haven't got a chance to come back and say, you haven't answered my question. So I hope I'm giving you something that you want.
Thank you. The next question is asking you, is the law or Torah as entirely positive as you've presented it? Because there are texts of terror, there are the curses of Deuteronomy and passages like that as well. So is it as positive as you've portrayed it?
Yeah. So many things to say in response to this. Another great question. So I would say that the law certainly has really difficult and tricky examples, stories, instances. So we have some of those texts of terror in the book of Genesis, for example, which is within the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And we certainly have the fabulous curses in Deuteronomy, which are a kind of a sign of what happens when you don't follow the law, really. So you'll be blessed if you choose life, but if you choose death, if you turn away from the ways of justice and God's ways, you will be cursed in these kind of particular ways. So it's not that the law is without conversations that are about violence, conversations that are about injustice. But overall, the law is a kind of almost a whole thing is seen as something positive. So just as we might talk about the Gospels, and we talk about the detail of the Gospel, but we also talk about the Gospel as something that is kind of the good news and a slightly more generic. That's perhaps how I'm moving between the law, which is kind of the more generic notion of God gives us a way back, to the laws which are more specific and maybe have tricky bits in that we have to negotiate and find our way around. And, not to kind of ramble on forever, but I think I'd also want to say, so even those texts of terror, they can be life-giving to us if we engage with them in a way that says, where is God's justice in this? And if it's not present in the text, how do we bring it in to the text? How do we bring it into situations like that today? So it's not that the law is necessarily saying this is how you should behave all the time with its examples. It's sometimes saying this is how not to behave. And the goodness is about responding, recognizing that, and finding a different response to it. That felt like I covered everything in that, in that discussion, that response. A question from Guernsey, who people there ask, what is the significance
of revealing Boaz's feet.
Okay. So, feet tends to be associated with, again, it's a euphemism for genitalia. It's not always, but often that's how it functions. And particularly legs as well. So legs even more so than feet. So in the passage, let's just see where it is. This is chapter 3, isn't it? She came in quietly and uncovered his feet. That we would presume that is really saying uncovered his genitalia. You know, that's really what is suggested there by the way that word is used elsewhere in other passages, and the way that it's used, for example, in Isaiah. There's a covering, the call of Isaiah and the angel that appears and the wings that cover different parts of the body. That again is assumed to be that the angel's wings are covering over the angel's genitalia, if we think that angels have genitalia. So things that you didn't expect to be talked about today.
Thank you. Another question. Might we be, in our approach today, might we be intellectualizing what we should just rather be using the Spirit of God to interpret?
Yeah, so another really good question, something that people struggle with. And I think people sometimes want to say, this is a book that is offered to us by God, and surely God gives us all the resources we need to read it and engage with it. And surely we should just be open and restful before it, allow the Spirit to speak through us. And I think there's lots of value of that, but there's also value in recognizing that's what people have sought to do over thousands of years. And they've also written down how they've done it, so we can benefit from their sitting and resting. So it's like, instead of just having our lifetime to sit and rest with the text, we can use the insights that have been gained over many people's lifetimes of sitting and resting with the text and enabling the Spirit to speak through us. And I think if we don't engage with people who have spent much of their time and expertise to understand the text and help us to understand the text, we're not taking the text seriously, and we're missing out on such riches because we ourselves are limited. We're only one person. I can't see everything. Much of what I've shared with you today is not from me, it's from many people that I've read, and I've suddenly thought, I've never seen that before. And often it's you know, when you have a situation where you ask someone to come. You know, whenever I'm trying to leave the house in the morning, I tend to ask one member of my family, what have I missed in terms of my clothing that I've put on, or have I got my hat on back to front or something. And sometimes you need an extra pair of eyes, or in this case, many extra pair of eyes, to look at the text and help you to see things that you hadn't noticed. And that's, for me, really important. If we take the Bible seriously, we take it seriously, we study it, we explore it, where it comes from, and we explore the many ways in which it can speak to us today. And to not do that, I think, is to do a disservice to the text, because we value it, so surely we want to spend time with it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I think we would agree that there has been a lot today where the insight that you've had or that you've passed on has just opened the text in a completely new way. And we thought we were familiar with it, or we thought we understood it, and we're going away with so much to think about and so much to explore. And really want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
Last question. Would you have a commentary on Ruth that you would recommend, one or two commentaries that you think this is particularly good?
Well, in the Bible Month notes, I've made some suggestions for further reading, further resources. And I think one text I always find really helpful is the Jewish Publication Society commentary. That they don't do commentaries on all the texts, but that, to me, always opens up a whole heap of different things I hadn't noticed, because the writers are writing from a Jewish perspective, and they are always far, far better at Hebrew, at intertextual allusions, at the tradition. So they're just they're much more able to pick up things that I just haven't noticed. But that's quite in-depth. So I've mentioned a couple of other resources that might be more accessible. One, I think, is the New Cambridge Bible Commentary series, which I always describe them as the yellow and blue series. They are a really good level of lots of learning from scholarship, but not in an overwhelming way. So you can just pick out some really good insights, and they're great across the biblical series. And then the two other things that I mentioned that are just very helpful and freely available are Bible Odyssey, which is a website by the Society for Biblical Literature based in the States. Lots of very short, little, tiny 3 or 4 paragraph articles, 1-minute video clips, just, what does this mean? What's that mean? What's the laws of redemption? What's the context for Ruth? All those different things. Wonderful. And the final one that I'd mention is the visual commentary on Scripture, which is a new resource by a variety of different groups that looks at a passage and then puts up 3 different art images alongside that passage and talks about how each of the 3 images interpret that passage and does some commentary. So it's got some, it's a great resource for us to kind of be engaging with. So the visual commentary on Scripture and Bible Odyssey are those 2.
I said there was a last question, and when I did that, I got a text almost straight away that said, "Hey, what happened to our question?" so one more.
Yes, absolutely.
The folk in Jersey would like to ask, one question we wanted to pose was, between the lines, since Ruth seems to be written out of the story, what sort of life for Ruth could she now expect?
Yeah, so it ends up being, it seems to be much more about Naomi and Naomi's restoration in some way than Ruth, isn't it? So, is Ruth cast aside by Naomi and Boaz because they've got what they need from her, and whatever that might be? Who knows? Does Ruth return to Moab? Who knows? Does Ruth live happily with her child and with the support of Naomi and Boaz? Who knows? We're not given that response. But I like to think that as a whole, the text is positive about Ruth and would therefore suggest that she finds her place within the community. It's another activity I've done that's with other groups and that's in the Bible Month magazine as well, is thinking about what kind of letter we might write to Ruth, what questions we might have to her. So that would be a good question to ask. Ruth, what happened next? How did you and Naomi and Boaz raise Obed? Were you happy in Judah? What did that feel like? And that's those kind of writing back to those characters, asking questions of them, sometimes really reveals what's at the heart of our engagement with the text. What's the desire what's the thing that we really want to find out from this text for us and for our own faith journeys? So, which character would you like to write to, and what questions would you have for them, or what would you want to say to them? Would be a thing for you to perhaps do a little bit of writing on and see what emerges. Sometimes you might be surprised. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for just opening our mind to all the other bits. I think we go away challenged. We go away with a lot of bits and pieces to think about. But I think it's fair to say we go away with this excitement for Bible Month and for the Book of Ruth and the opportunity to really get into it.
Yeah,
So every blessing, and thank you so much for your time and for the effort and coming to share it with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you to the folk who have joined us through the streaming. We really would like your feedback about how it worked for you if you weren't in the room for us today, so that we can do it better and better as we learn to do the streaming thing really well. So if you've been watching from somewhere remote, please do leave us a few comments, a few ideas, and it would be nice to know just how many people were joining with us today. But thank you all for your time.